45 million Americans check a single box on the census form every 10 years, a number that rivals English, the closest competitor, for the largest self-identified ancestry group in the country. It isn't the ancestry taught as the American founding story. It isn't the ancestry that dominates the history books, the reenactments, or the monuments built to the earliest colonists. And when geneticists compared it against the actual DNA of modern Americans, the pattern went even deeper than the census had ever suggested. A man in Wisconsin, raised on stories of Mayflower pilgrims and English settlers, opened his genetic results to find his largest single ancestry component wasn't English at all. A woman in Pennsylvania, whose family had spoken only English for 4 generations, discovered a name buried in her genome that no living relative could explain. Neither had a photograph, a letter, or a family story to account for what the data was telling them. So scientists asked a question the American origin story had never really answered. If the nation's founding myth centers on English colonists crossing the Atlantic, why does the actual genetic and demographic record point somewhere else entirely? And why did an entire ancestry, one carried by tens of millions of Americans, spend most of the 20th century trying to disappear? The investigation that followed didn't rely on old letters or oral history. It relied on comparing the genomes of hundreds of thousands of Americans against detailed reference populations across Europe. What researchers found didn't just correct a historical assumption. It uncovered a story of deliberate, coordinated forgetting, one large enough to reshape how an entire country understood its own ancestry, and one the census itself had been quietly hinting at for decades before anyone thought to check the DNA. For most of American history, the story told in classrooms began the same way. English colonists arrived at Jamestown and Plymouth. They built the original 13 colonies. Their language, their laws, and their institutions became the scaffolding of the new nation. Every other European group that followed, the story implied, arrived later and mattered less to the country's fundamental character. That narrative wasn't entirely invented. English colonization did shape the legal and political structure of the United States in lasting ways. But a founding narrative built around one group's institutions is not the same thing as a demographic record of who actually settled the country, married into it, and had children there, generation after generation, for the next 300 years. Beginning in the 1700s and accelerating through the 1800s, an enormous wave of migration arrived in America from the German-speaking regions of Central Europe. Farmers from the Palatinate, craftsmen from Bavaria, entire communities from Prussia and Baden-Württemberg. They settled heavily in Pennsylvania, the Midwest, and Texas, often in numbers large enough to run German-language newspapers, German-language schools, and entire towns where English was rarely spoken at home. Visit some of those towns today, and the physical shell is still standing, even though almost nothing inside it speaks German anymore. A Lutheran church cornerstone still carries a German inscription above doors where every sermon is now delivered in English. A small town cemetery is filled with headstones carved in a language none of the visiting descendants can read. The street sign still bears a family name that hasn't been spoken with a German accent in 3 generations. The infrastructure survived the erasure. The culture living inside it did not. The reasons so many Germans crossed the Atlantic in the first place are their own story, and understanding it makes what came later land harder. Failed revolutions swept across the German states in 1848, crushing hopes for unified, representative government and sending thousands of politically active refugees fleeing abroad. Land scarcity, subdivided by inheritance across generations of large families, left many rural Germans with plots too small to support a household. Meanwhile, America was offering the opposite. The Homestead Act promised free land to anyone willing to work it. Religious minorities, including various Protestant sects facing pressure at home, found in America a place to worship without state interference. Ships left regularly from the ports of Bremen and Hamburg, and one successful immigrant's letter home, describing cheap land and steady wages, could pull an entire extended family, then an entire village, across the ocean in what became a self-sustaining chain of migration lasting nearly a century. By the early 20th century, German Americans made up one of the largest ethnic populations in the United States, rivaling or exceeding every other European group, including the English. Cities like Milwaukee, Cincinnati, and St. Louis had thriving German cultural institutions, breweries, churches, and social clubs. In some Midwestern counties, German was the dominant language spoken in homes and schools well into the 20th century, printed on ballots, taught in public classrooms, and preached from the pulpit every Sunday. The scale of that integration is easy to underestimate today. In the late 19th century, more than 800 German-language newspapers operated across the United States, some of them editorializing on national politics, with as much influence as their English-language counterparts. A German-American lyceum circuit brought lectures, music, and cultural programming to communities across the Midwest. Presidential candidates courted the German-American vote directly, sometimes campaigning in German themselves in cities like Cincinnati and Milwaukee. To suggest in 1880 that German Americans were somehow foreign or suspect would have struck most Americans as absurd. They were not a marginal community waiting to be assimilated. They were a central pillar of American public life, as visible and as permanent as any other. Then, within the span of a single generation, most of it vanished from public life almost entirely. Here's how scientists went looking for what happened to it, stripped to its essence. A person's genome carries segments of DNA that can be matched against reference populations from specific regions of the world, whether northern Germany, the British Isles, Scandinavia, or southern Europe. By comparing thousands of these segments across large samples of Americans, researchers can estimate what proportion of a population's ancestry traces to each region, and how those proportions compare to what people actually believe about their own heritage. Researchers at 23andMe, along with academic population geneticists, ran exactly this comparison across hundreds of thousands of American customers who consented to research. The genetic data confirmed something the U.S. Census had already been quietly recording for decades, largely unnoticed outside demography circles. When Americans are asked to name their ancestry, unprompted, German consistently ranks as one of the largest single European ancestries reported, rivaling English and outpacing Irish, Italian, and every other individual European origin. That question only exists on the census because of a change made in 1980 when the Census Bureau first added an open-ended ancestry question, inviting people to write in whatever origin they identified with, rather than checking a fixed racial or national category. Before that year, there was no consistent national mechanism for measuring how many Americans considered themselves German, which is part of why the scale of German ancestry had gone largely unnoticed for so long. The moment the government finally asked the right question, in the right way, an enormous, previously invisible population appeared almost overnight in the data, decades before genetic testing would confirm it at the molecular level. The genetic findings went further than self-reported ancestry alone. Across broad swaths of the Midwest, from Wisconsin through Ohio, Indiana, and into the Great Plains, researchers found consistently elevated proportions of Central European ancestry, concentrated in patterns that mapped almost precisely onto 19th century German settlement corridors. The DNA wasn't just present, it was regionally organized. Decades after the language, the newspapers, and the public identity built around it had all but disappeared from daily life. That contradiction was the real mystery. If German ancestry was this widespread and this concentrated, why did it leave so little visible trace in American public culture by the time genetic testing became available? Why did so few people, compared to the actual numbers, identify strongly with it, celebrate it, or even know its details? The answer researchers kept arriving at wasn't really genetic at all. It was historical, and it happened with startling speed. In April 1917, the United States entered the First World War against Germany. Almost overnight, German Americans, the single largest ethnic group in the country at the time, became suspects in their own communities. This happened despite the fact that hundreds of thousands of German Americans would go on to serve in the United States military during both World Wars, fighting under the American flag against the country their grandparents had left behind generations earlier. Their loyalty, proven in uniform, did little to slow the suspicion aimed at their families back home. State governments banned the teaching of German in public schools. Some states outlawed speaking German in public entirely. Restaurant menus quietly renamed dishes to sound less German, a small but telling symptom of a much larger unraveling taking place underneath. The pressure wasn't only rhetorical. German-language newspapers, which had numbered in the hundreds nationwide, shut down by the dozens within a few years, either from government pressure, boycotts, or owners choosing to close rather than risk violence. Vigilante mobs, sometimes with local law enforcement standing by and doing nothing to intervene, targeted German-American families, businesses, and churches across the Midwest and beyond. The churches were hit especially hard. Lutheran and Catholic parishes that had conducted services entirely in German for generations were pressured to switch to English overnight, sometimes under direct threat. In several communities, congregations were warned that continuing to pray in German could result in arrest. This wasn't incidental damage. It was a targeted dismantling of the exact institutions that had kept German language and culture alive across generations. In April 1918, a German-born coal miner named Robert Prager was lynched by a mob in Illinois, accused, without evidence, of disloyalty. His killers were tried and acquitted within minutes by a local jury, a verdict that sent an unmistakable message to every German-speaking family watching from a safe distance. Faced with this pressure, German-American families made a decision, repeated independently across thousands of households, that would permanently reshape how the group appeared in the historical and cultural record. They anglicized their names. Schmidt became Smith. Miller became Miller. Brown became Brown. Zimmerman became Carpenter. They stopped speaking German at home, stopped teaching it to their children, and in many cases, stopped telling their children the details of where the family had come from at all. This is what that decision looked like, multiplied across an entire ethnic population, rather than confined to a single family's story. A German-speaking household in rural Wisconsin in 1916 might have read a German newspaper, attended a German-language church service, and spoken German at the dinner table every night. By 1920, the newspaper had closed. The church service had shifted to English, and the children, encouraged by parents who wanted them protected from suspicion and violence, grew up speaking only English, with a surname that no longer obviously marked them as German at all, and often no clear sense of what had been left behind to make that possible. A second wave of the same pressure arrived barely 2 decades later. When the United States entered the Second World War against Nazi Germany in 1941, German-American communities faced renewed suspicion, though the backlash was generally less violent than during the First War, tempered in part by the lessons of 1917 and by the sheer size of the German-American population by that point. Even so, families who had only partially re-embraced German language and culture after the First War's pressures eased often chose, once again, to minimize any visible connection to their heritage, quietly reinforcing a pattern of concealment that had already been rehearsed once before. Decades later, when the 1990 census gave Americans the option to write in American as their sole ancestry, the number who chose that answer surged dramatically, far more than any single European nationality could account for on its own. Researchers studying the pattern noted that many of these respondents lived in exactly the regions where German settlement had once been heaviest. American had become, for a significant share of them, less a proud, singular identity than a closed door, a way of not having to explain a heritage that 2 wars had taught their families to leave unspoken. By the time genetic testing became widely available in the 21st century, the descendants of this enormous 19th century migration were, in most cases, culturally indistinguishable from the broader American population. They had English surnames, English as a first language going back 3 or 4 generations, and often no specific family knowledge of where in Europe their ancestors had actually come from. Unlike Irish, Italian, and Jewish Americans, who experienced vibrant cultural revivals in the 1970s and 1980s, reclaiming language, food, music, and public pride in their heritage, German Americans never had an equivalent moment. There was, in a real sense, nothing left to revive. The newspapers were gone, the language instruction was gone, the churches had switched permanently to English. The grandparents who might have passed down the stories had, in many cases, decided decades earlier that those stories were safer left untold. Rebuilding an identity from that little material was a far heavier task than reclaiming one that had simply gone quiet for a generation. Their DNA, however, hadn't forgotten anything at all. This is where the comparison against modern Americans produced its most striking pattern. When researchers looked at self-identified white Americans with no strong sense of specific European ancestry, people who simply described themselves as American or gave a vague answer when asked, the genetic data very often revealed substantial German or broader Central European ancestry, frequently as the single largest component in their genome, larger than any English, Irish, or Scandinavian contribution. In other words, an enormous number of Americans whose families had spent a century actively obscuring their German ancestry were unknowingly carrying it as their dominant genetic inheritance all along. The anglicized surname had done its job in public. The genome had never gotten the memo. This pattern showed up with particular strength in specific regions. Wisconsin, long known for its brewing industry and German cultural remnants, showed some of the highest concentrations of German-associated ancestry in the country. Texas Hill Country, settled heavily by German immigrants in the mid-1800s who established towns like Fredericksburg and New Braunfels, showed a similar signature, even though most residents today have no functional connection to the German language at all. Pennsylvania's so-called Pennsylvania Dutch population, actually a corruption of Deutsch, meaning German, showed ancestry patterns, tracing directly back to those same 18th century Palatinate migrations, still legible in the genome more than 250 years later, long after the last fluent speaker in most of those families had passed away. The Pennsylvania Dutch are worth pausing on because their story diverges from the broader pattern in a revealing way. Unlike most German Americans, they largely kept their language and identity intact through both world wars, and the reasons why say a great deal about how erasure actually worked. They had arrived generations earlier than the 19th century wave, many fighting in the Revolutionary War itself, which made their American credentials harder to question. More importantly, their German language wasn't tied primarily to national origin. It was tied to religious practice carried by Anabaptist and Pietist communities for whom speaking German was inseparable from worship itself. Attacking that language meant attacking religious freedom directly, a line that even wartime suspicion was more reluctant to cross. Where German identity was rooted in nationality, it was largely erased. Where it was rooted in faith, it largely survived. These estimates, like all genetic ancestry data, come with real limitations worth stating plainly. Reference populations for Central Europe have historically been less finely resolved than those for the British Isles, partly because Germany's modern borders were drawn relatively recently, following centuries of fragmented principalities, kingdoms, and city-states with their own regional populations. This makes some ancestry estimates broader than researchers would prefer, grouping related but distinct populations under a single Central European label. Later studies, using denser reference panels drawn from specific German regions, have refined these estimates considerably. But the core finding, that German ancestry is both larger and more widespread among Americans than public identity suggests, has held up consistently across multiple independent research efforts. The immigration numbers themselves carry some uncertainty too, and it's worth being precise about the range rather than picking the most dramatic figure available. Historians estimate that somewhere between 5.5 and 8 million Germans immigrated to the United States between 1820 and 1920, with most demographic studies clustering around 7 million as a reasonable working figure. Even at the more conservative end of that range, it remains one of the largest single national migrations in American history, exceeding immigration from Ireland, Italy, or any other individual European country across the same century. The comparison against English ancestry specifically revealed something else researchers hadn't fully anticipated going in. English ancestry, while genuinely present and significant across much of the country, particularly in New England and parts of the South, was not the dominant single component in as many Americans' genomes as the founding narrative would suggest. It was often present in smaller proportions, mixed heavily with Scottish, Irish, Welsh, German, and other Northern European ancestries, reflecting centuries of intermarriage across regional and ethnic lines that the English colonist story had never accounted for. This didn't mean English ancestry was unimportant or overstated as a historical influence. Colonial institutions, language, and law were shaped disproportionately by early English settlement, regardless of what later demographic waves eventually did to the population's genetic makeup. But institutional influence and genetic ancestry are two different kinds of inheritance, and the data made clear they hadn't stayed aligned over 3 centuries of migration, war, and intermarriage. There's a broader historical pattern worth sitting with here. Unlike the story of coerced mixing between white and black Americans under slavery, the German-American story is one of voluntary migration followed by deliberate defensive concealment. Millions of people chose to come to America, often seeking land, religious freedom, or escape from conflict and economic hardship in the fragmented German states. Their concealment came later, forced by 2 world wars against the very country their ancestors had left behind. It's a different mechanism producing a strikingly similar outcome, a genetic inheritance far larger than the visible cultural record would ever suggest to someone relying on family stories alone. Genetic ancestry and public identity, once again, have never mapped cleanly onto each other in America. In this case, shows it just as clearly as any other. A person's genome might carry a dominant German signature while their family has identified simply as American, with no ethnic qualifier at all, for 3 or 4 generations, an identity itself partly manufactured by the same historical pressure that erased the German label in the first place. Genetics can reveal where the ancestry came from. It cannot restore the language, the customs, or the family knowledge that was deliberately let go of, generation by generation, in the name of safety. If you are an American watching this, especially one who has never felt a strong pull toward any specific European ancestry, there's a real statistical chance that a German thread runs through your genome more strongly than you'd guess, whether your surname would ever suggest it or not. This isn't speculation offered for effect. It follows directly from how widespread this migration was, and how thoroughly its visible traces were erased within living memory, twice within the span of a single century. Return to that man in Wisconsin, holding a result that didn't match the story he'd grown up with. He wasn't wrong to believe an English thread ran somewhere through his family. Many Americans carry one. But the dominant thread in his own genome told a different, quieter story, one that began not on the Mayflower, but on a ship from Bremen or Hamburg sometime in the 1800s, carrying a family whose name, language, and public identity would all be deliberately set aside within a few decades of arriving, not because the family forgot who they were, but because remembering for a time had become dangerous. Long before any census form offered an ancestry box to check, and long before 2 world wars gave millions of families a reason to anglicize a name or stop teaching a language to their children, the migration itself had already happened, and the genome had already recorded it. It never needed a newspaper, a church record, or a family story to keep that account accurate. It simply waited, unaffected by anything anyone chose to rename, until a different kind of science finally learned how to read what had been there all along.